Hi everyone, I'm David from the Cyto project, and this is a video about transaction monetization. It's about the economics of the Infura problem. A lot of people think we're concerned they might shut off some servers. It's not that at all. What we're interested in is how to run an open permissionless network. And if we go back to the original network, we're going to note that Bitcoin did it by having a volunteer peer-to-peer network, where we had volunteers run the computers that serviced users with data and collected their transactions for the block producers. So the question we want to know is, we know volunteers won't do this at scale. Will for-profit companies perform this function? And that means we need a company to do two things. First, they've got to run the expensive user-facing infrastructure that companies like Infura run that collect transactions from users. And note here, we're not just talking about taking a fiber optic pipe, hooking it up to the next door miner and leeching off of them. You've got to spend a lot of money to serve users a ton of data at scale. So you got to collect, and then you've also got to share, which means you've got to take the fees and the money you've collected and share them with the other miners and block producers. And if you don't do this, the network breaks. One CPU, one vote fails. The biggest miners, the biggest block producers get even bigger, and it becomes possible for the bigger guys to start doing things like bullying the smaller participants. Your network monopolizes, it closes. So what does economics say about our ability to find a company that will both share and collect? Well, let's take a look at a simple model. This only has two peers. They're producing equal blocks, they're collecting equal fees, and it's got some reasonable numbers on costs and revenue. What economics does is we model this. We take a look at how much money you make if you share versus how much money you make if you hoard, depending both on what you do and what the other player does. And if you plug in the numbers, and it's going to look this way regardless of the number of peers you have, you get something that looks like this. And note here that player red, no matter what player green is doing, no matter if they're sharing or hoarding, player red is always better off hoarding themselves. And it's the same for player green. And what that means is that we're in this Nash equilibrium that's a hoarding equilibrium, where no matter what other people do, your best strategic response, your most profitable situation is to hoard. So that's what everyone does. And fundamentally, that's because you make more money if you take all of the fees that you've collected instead of dividing them up and only taking a portion of them. Now, this is a rather inconvenient truth, and when we run into computer scientists and distributed systems people, they often come with what we call the blockchain objections, which are attempts to try to explain why this isn't actually what's happening, despite the fact that you can look out at the industry and see this is exactly what's happening. And the first objection you'll often run into is that users won't permit this. And they'll say, look, users will defend the system by not giving their transactions to people that don't share. And this is nonsense for two reasons. First, it's turning users into policemen and volunteers who need to pay more money. And users don't have an incentive to do that. In fact, users want the opposite. Users don't want to pay extra fees. Users want their data monetized, and they want to have free services that are paid for by companies essentially finding creative ways to make money with their data, and cannibalizing the network fee, that's fine. So objection one doesn't make any sense. Objection two is also, it's a bit weirder. You'll run into people who are what we like to call, very naive libertarians. And they'll say things like, but, that would be suboptimal. And what they really mean is they mean the market is giving us this outcome that's bad, and that's not what markets do. It's very difficult to talk to people in this mindset because, well, there are many situations in which markets fail. And if the incentives are wrong, we end up in a market failure, and this is the nature of the problem. And in fact, one of the big problems in blockchain is that people cannot recognize market failures, so they think that these underlying economic problems are actually technical problems when they're not. The third objection is one of the more interesting ones. It's the idea that consensus won't permit this. And people will say, look, if you don't share your fees and transactions, your blocks, they're not going to propagate quickly. You're going to get orphaned, and then, haha, showed you should have shared. And this sounds better, but it is still techno nonsense. And remember this, if we are in a hoarding equilibrium, and we are, no one's blocks are any faster or slower than anyone else's. So there's no propagation penalty for hoarders. And even if we could get to a fantasy land sharing equilibrium, if our network costs are anywhere near market rates, what happens is if you start getting punished for collecting transactions and hoarding them, what you do is you switch into not collecting. You basically you don't collect transactions from users, and you don't pay the costs associated with it. And instead, you just parasitically leech off of the transactions that other people are sharing. And this is the free riding problem in blockchain. And free riding leads to cartelization closure and eventually monopolization. So we've got a takeaway. The takeaway here is that the free market will let us do one of two things. We can incentivize firms to collect transactions, or we can incentivize them to share transactions other people collected. But we can't incentivize both. And in order to have an open permissionless network, what this means is we need to take proof of work and proof of stake networks, and we need to protect them in Sado class fee routing layers that will keep their network layers permissionless and open. And we talk a lot about how to do that in other parts of the site. I encourage you to visit us at sado.io.